trucking through chapter 1. We have just heard from Nick about the East and West egg. We talked a little bit about some of the symbolic implications, what those might be representing, old money versus new money. Nick is, of course, on the West egg, and he lives right by Gatsby's mansion. But as he describes it here, he says, since he didn't know Mr. Gatsby, it was a mansion inhabited by a gentleman of that name. Okay? So, now here we get to the next step, which is that across the Courtesy Bay, the white palaces of fashionable East Egg glittered along the water. And the history of the summer really begins on the evening I drove over there to have dinner with the Tom Buchanans. Daisy was my second cousin, once removed, and I'd known Tom in college. And just after the war, I spent 2 days with them in Chicago. Okay, so notice what Nick's doing here. He's locating us now in this story of what happened in the summer of 1922 on the West and East eggs. Okay, that's where we are. All right, he's visiting his cousin Daisy. She and Tom are East egg. That means they are old money. Okay, all right, let's see what we learn about Daisy and Tom here. And that's what you should be focusing on in the rest of this chapter, is what we learn about Daisy and Tom and then their friend Jordan. Tom is extraordinarily wealthy. He was a powerful football player at Yale, but he is also someone who is extremely wealthy. Okay, and he says here, now he'd left Chicago and come east in a fashion that rather took your breath away. For instance, he brought down a string of polo ponies from Lake Forest. He brought a fleet of polo ponies from the Midwest to the East Coast in 1922. I mean, think about the money that must have cost to bring your horses that far. My goodness. But, of course, he has the money. Now, here's another interesting thing to notice, guys. That, you know, we kind of sometimes lose sight of it because Tom and Daisy are described as being so wealthy. They are young. They are Nick's age. They are under 30, okay? But they are so enormously wealthy, even at this young age, and it's because they inherited money. They are old money, okay? So, they talk a little bit about why they came east, and what happens when, so Nick gives us a little bit of background there. But now we're learning about Tom, okay? Tom Buchanan. He had changed since he was in college when Nick knew him, but he's a man of 30, very young, right? 2 shining, arrogant eyes, established dominance, give him the appearance of always aggressively leaning forward, the enormous power of that body. The great pack of muscle when his shifting when his shoulder moved. Look at this last line. It was a body capable of enormous leverage, a cruel body. Okay? So look at the way Tom is characterized in that first paragraph. So much about his physicality, his power, his brutishness. Okay? All right. So, now, we go on talking a little bit more. You know, Tom does not seem like a nice guy. It certainly doesn't sound like he was liked at Yale. A lot of people thought he was a rich dick. And I think as we're going to get to know him more, we'll soon agree with that. Okay? Tom leads Nick into the house, and then he sees they see the 2 young women who ballooned slowly to the floor. The younger one was the stranger, and she was extended at full length. The other one was Daisy. That's his cousin. And look at her. Look at this description of her. She made an attempt to rise. She leaned slightly forward with a conscientious expression. Then she laughed an absurd, charming little laugh, and I laughed too and came forward into the room. Look at that contrast between Tom's cruel, brutish body and Daisy's attempt to rise, which is really just a slight lean and a charming little laugh. And she says, I'm paralyzed, paralyzed with happiness. Okay? All right. So then they go on. He gets introduced to Jordan Baker. He now gets into a conversation with his second cousin, Daisy. She asks him, do people back in Chicago miss me? And he says, the whole town is desolate. All the cars have left the left rear wheel painted black as a mourning wreath, and there's a persistent wail all along the North Shore. So, well, obviously some exaggeration here, but, they're cousins. They're having fun. And Daisy immediately reacts and says, how gorgeous. Let's go back, Tom, tomorrow. We find out that Tom and Daisy have a baby. She's 2 years old. And then Tom comes over. They talk about the business a little bit. We find out a little bit about Jordan, who wakes up, basically. Listen to our first line from Jordan, right? I'm stiff, she complained. I've been lying on that sofa for as long as I can remember. Talk about life of leisure and, just doing nothing, right? But that's the life they live, okay? All right. So, we hear a little bit more about them. Jordan says, oh, you live in West Egg. I know somebody there. You must know Gatsby. And then all of a sudden, Gatsby, demanded Daisy. What Gatsby? Keep an eye on that line, guys. That's our first awareness that Daisy is thinking about or knows this Gatsby. Okay? All right. Tom compelled me from the room. Look at these physical descriptions of Tom. He wedged his tense arm imperatively under mine, and it compelled me from the room as though he were moving a checker to another square. Wow, think about the way in which Tom's body imposes upon the world around him. Okay? All right. So, they have some conversation. We hear this dispute between Tom and Daisy over the fact that Tom kind of hurt her, right? He kind of brushed into her and it hurt her. And she says, Tom, you didn't mean to do it, but that's what I get for marrying a brute of a man, a great big hulking physical specimen of a... And then Tom inserts an objection there. He hates that word. But look there's already this contrast between Daisy's delicacy and Tom's hulkishness. Okay? All right, so they go on, talk a little bit more. Tom talks about civilizations going to pieces. Whoa, here's where we hear about the beginning of Tom's racism. He's gotten to be a terrible pessimist about things. Have you read The Rise of the Colored Empire by this man Goddard? And he says it's a fine book and everybody ought to read it. And the idea is if we don't look out, the white race will be utterly submerged. It's all scientific stuff. Okay? So, Tom is this guy, this hulking physical man who has this idea of the whites as being dominant, and the whites are the ones who need to be in control of things. And he says we're all Nordics, and we've all produced these things. We're the ones responsible for this civilization. Okay? Remember, this, 1922, guys. This is only a dozen years after Heart of Darkness was written. Okay? So, we still have at this time these strong ideas and prejudices about racial differences and disparities. Okay, and Tom here is clearly aligning himself on the side of the racists, right? The ones who prioritize the whites over other races. Okay? All right. So, all right. We hear that a phone call has broken up the meal they're having. And then Jordan tells Nick that Tom has a woman, a mistress in New York, okay, which is not something Daisy's very pleased to hear about, okay. And it doesn't sound like Daisy's doing too well, okay. And look at what she says that she thought when her daughter was born. She says, "I'm glad it's a girl and I hope she'll be a fool. The best thing a girl can be in this world is a beautiful little fool." So let's, see. Why would Daisy say something like that? Let's see what we learn more about her. Okay. And now as we go on, Nick finally realizes who Jordan Baker is. She's a professional golfer. And Daisy starts joking about how she's gonna set up Jordan and Nick. But then, Daisy remembers, oh, wait, we heard you were engaged, Nick. Pay attention to this, okay? Nick shares a little bit about how he, had someone he was involved with in the Midwest, but that it's just an old friend and he doesn't want to be pushed into marriage, okay? So that's where that scene ends. Nick goes home. Pay very close attention to the closing of this chapter because this is his first time seeing Jay Gatsby. And he doesn't know it's Jay Gatsby at that time, but he does say, like, whoever was standing there, by his movements and his position of his feet, suggested that it was Mr. Gatsby himself, right? Now, Nick decides he's going to call to him, say hello, but then he didn't call because it seemed like Gatsby wanted to be left alone. And what happens here is it looks to Nick like Gatsby's trembling. And all Nick can see is that Gatsby must be looking at a single green light. It's minute and far away, and it might have been the end of a dock. So he's looking across the bay that separates his west egg from the east egg, and he sees a light at the end of a dock. Or that's what Nick assumes it to be. And then, when Nick looked again for Gatsby, he had vanished. So, think about that lasting image of Gatsby, of Nick seeing Gatsby reaching across, standing on his own lawn and reaching out as if trying to grasp that light. What's going on there? Okay. There was a lot in that chapter, guys, but we needed to go through it in that kind of detail. Think about all the things we learned. We started with Nick telling us his ambivalent understanding of Gatsby. It evolved then into a discussion of how Nick came out to West Egg. And then we launched into this social setting with his cousin Daisy, her brutish, physical, racist husband Tom, and their friend Jordan Baker, who sounds like she could be a love interest for young Nick here. All right? That's a lot to pack into chapter 1. And we need to pay attention to every one of those threads as it develops through the novel. All right, I know this was a long screencast, but I think it was important. Dr. Vella, out.